The carriage wheel cracked against the stone bridge with a sound like a gunshot, and Clara Bennett was thrown sideways into the door before she understood what was happening. The horses screamed. The driver shouted something she could not make out over the pounding rain. Then the whole carriage tipped, slow at first, then all at once, and she was falling. She landed hard in the mud at the edge of the road, the breath knocked clean out of her chest. Above her, the carriage lay on its side, one wheel still spinning uselessly in the wind. Her trunk had split open somewhere behind her, and her few possessions were scattered across the wet grass like the pieces of a life she had not yet begun to live. 3 men stepped out from the tree line before she had even managed to sit up. They were not there to help her. She understood that within seconds from the way they moved, unhurried, certain, the way hunters move when they already believe the outcome is settled. The tallest of them carried a pistol loose in his hand, not aimed, simply held as though the threat of it was enough. Clara pressed her back against the overturned carriage and tried to think. She had 11 pounds sewn into the lining of her coat, all the money she owned in the world, meant to last her until her first wages arrived at Netherby Hall. She had a letter of employment in her pocket, signed by a man she had never met, a man whose name alone made the innkeeper at her last stop go quiet and glance toward the door, as though saying it too loudly might summon him. The tallest man crouched down in front of her, close enough that she could smell the drink on him. "Now then," he said, "let's not make this difficult." She did not answer. She had learned in 23 years of a life that had rarely been gentle with her, that silence sometimes served better than words. Her hand moved, slow and careful, toward the small knife she kept in her boot, more from habit than any real belief it would save her. That was when the sound came. Hooves, many of them, moving fast along the road from the north, and with them came a kind of stillness in the 3 men that had not been there a moment before. The tallest one straightened. The other 2 exchanged a look. "Riders," one of them said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there when he spoke to Clara, something close to fear. 6 horsemen came around the bend at a gallop, dark cloaks streaming behind them in the rain, and at their head rode a man on a black horse who did not slow as he approached, who rode straight toward the 3 men as though they were nothing more than an obstacle in the road. He wore no hat. His dark hair was plastered flat against his forehead by the rain, and his face, when Clara finally saw it clearly, was utterly without expression. That was the thing she would remember most afterward. Not anger. Not even contempt. Simply nothing at all, as though the men standing in his path were beneath the effort of a single flicker of feeling. "Netherby," the tallest man breathed, and dropped the pistol as though it had suddenly grown too hot to hold. The name moved through Clara like cold water. This was the man she had been traveling to serve. This was the Duke whose letter sat folded in her pocket, whose reputation had followed her the entire length of her journey in the lowered voices of strangers. He did not dismount at first. He simply looked at the 3 men from atop his horse, and the silence stretched long enough that one of them, the youngest, began to back away toward the trees. "You will leave," the Duke said. His voice was low, unhurried, and somehow more frightening for its calm. "Now. And if I find that any of you have taken so much as a thread from that carriage, I will make certain you regret it for whatever remains of your lives." They did not need telling twice. Within moments the 3 men had vanished into the trees, and the road held only the Duke, his 6 riders, the wrecked carriage, and Clara Bennett, still sitting in the mud with her hand frozen halfway to her boot. He dismounted then, and walked toward her with the same unhurried certainty he had shown the highwaymen. And for one strange moment, Clara found herself more afraid of his approach than she had been of the men with the pistol. There was something in the way the world seemed to bend around him, the way his own riders kept a careful distance, that told her this was not a man accustomed to being questioned. He stopped a few feet away and looked down at her, taking in the mud on her dress, the scattered contents of her trunk, the letter half visible where it had fallen from her pocket into the wet grass. "You are hurt?" he asked. It was not spoken with any particular warmth. It was, if anything, a question asked the way one might ask after a horse that had stumbled, practical rather than tender. "No," Clara said, and got to her feet without accepting the hand he had not offered. "Only shaken." Something crossed his face then, so briefly she almost missed it. Surprise, perhaps. She would learn in the weeks that followed that very few people spoke to him without a tremor in their voice, and fewer still stood up without help when he was standing close enough to give it. "You are the woman engaged to teach my niece," he said. It was not a question. He had clearly already read the letter lying in the grass, or perhaps he had simply known, from the moment he saw the wrecked carriage on the road to his own estate, exactly who she must be. "Clara Bennett," she said. "Yes, Your Grace." He studied her for a long moment, and she made herself hold his gaze, though every instinct told her to look away, to lower her eyes the way she had seen the innkeeper's wife do at the mere mention of his name. She did not know, then, that this alone would mark her as different from everyone else who had ever stood before him. "Gather what you can carry," he said finally, turning back toward his horse. "The rest will be sent for. You will ride the remainder of the way with us. There is no time to wait for another carriage, and I do not intend to leave a young woman on this road after dark, not with company like that still somewhere in the trees." It was, Clara realized, the closest thing to kindness she had heard from him, wrapped so tightly in practicality that it barely resembled kindness at all. She gathered what she could, a single bag, her letter, a small portrait of her late mother that she would have crawled through fire to save, and allowed one of the riders to help her onto a horse behind him, since the Duke himself did not offer. They rode the rest of the way to Netherby Hall in silence, the rain finally beginning to ease, and Clara spent the journey studying the back of the Duke's dark head, where he rode ahead of the party, wondering what kind of man could frighten armed robbers into fleeing with nothing more than the sound of his own name. The hall itself rose out of the mist as they crested the final hill, gray stone and tall windows, more imposing than any building Clara had ever seen outside a picture book. Servants came running out into the last of the rain the moment the riders were spotted, and Clara watched, fascinated despite herself, at how quickly the courtyard organized itself around the Duke's arrival. Nobody spoke above a murmur. Nobody met his eyes directly. A stable boy took the reins of his horse with hands that visibly shook, though the Duke did nothing more threatening than dismount and hand them over without a word. An older woman in a gray dress, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to strain at her scalp, came forward and dipped into a quick, nervous curtsy. "Your Grace, we did not expect you back until evening the roads." "There was an incident," the Duke said, cutting her off without any apparent cruelty, simply as a man accustomed to being obeyed rather than explained to. "This is Miss Bennet. She will be looking after Lucy. See that she is settled and that something dry is found for her to wear." The housekeeper turned to Clara with an expression that seemed to flicker between pity and warning, as though she wanted to say something and thought better of it. "This way, miss," she said instead, and led Clara toward the great doors. Clara glanced back once before she stepped inside. The Duke stood alone in the courtyard, rain still falling lightly around him, staring up at one of the high windows on the eastern side of the house with an expression she could not read, something that looked, for just a moment, almost like grief, before it vanished behind the same cold stillness she had seen on the road. She did not know, then, that the window he was looking at belonged to a room that had not been opened in 3 years. She did not know about his brother, or the letter that had come in the night, or the promise the Duke had made to a dying man that he had spent every day since trying, and failing, to keep. She knew only that the most feared man in England had just saved her from 3 armed strangers without raising his voice above a murmur, and that something about the way he had looked at that window told her his coldness was not the whole of him, only the part he allowed the world to see. Inside, the hall was grand in a way that made her feel very small and very out of place. High ceilings, dark wood, portraits of long-dead Ashwoods staring down from the walls with the same unreadable expression she had seen on the current Duke's face, as though sternness had been bred into the family alongside the title. The housekeeper, who introduced herself as Mrs. Whitfield, led her up a wide staircase and down a corridor lined with closed doors. "You'll be in the room beside the nursery," Mrs. Whitfield said, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. "Miss Lucy is a sweet child, but she has had a hard time of it, and I'll say no more than that. It isn't my place. As for his grace, she paused at the top of the stairs, glancing back the way they had come, as though the Duke might be listening from somewhere below. You'll do well to keep your head down and your voice low. That is all the advice I can offer you, miss, and I offer it kindly. Thank you, Clara said, though she found she did not much want the advice, not after what she had seen in the courtyard. That night, after she had changed into dry clothes and eaten a small supper brought up on a tray by a young maid who would not stay long enough to be thanked properly, Clara lay awake listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere down the corridor she heard footsteps, slow and even, pacing back and forth for what felt like an hour before finally stopping. She thought of the Duke standing alone in the rain, staring up at that closed window, and found herself wondering, against every warning she had been given that day, what exactly it was that a man so feared could possibly be afraid of himself. She did not yet have an answer, but she had already decided without quite meaning to that she intended to find one. Morning came gray and quiet over Netherby Hall, and Clara woke to the sound of a child crying softly through the wall. She rose at once, pulled on her dress without bothering to call for help with the buttons, and followed the sound into the corridor. The nursery door stood ajar. Inside, a girl of perhaps 7 sat curled on the window seat, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring out at the gray morning with the kind of stillness that seemed far too old for a child her age. A nursemaid hovered nearby, wringing her hands, clearly unsure what to do. Miss Lucy has these mornings, the nursemaid whispered when she saw Clara. Ever since her father passed, she won't say what troubles her, she only sits like that till it passes. Clara did not ask permission. She crossed the room and sat down on the window seat, not too close, leaving space enough that the girl would not feel crowded, and looked out at the same gray view. I don't much like mornings like this either, Clara said quietly, to the window rather than to the girl. Everything feels heavier when the sky is that color. Lucy did not answer, but her shoulders loosened just slightly, and after a while she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Are you the new governess?" "I am. My name is Clara." "They never stay long," Lucy said, and there was no self-pity in it, only a flat statement of fact, the kind of thing a child says when they have simply stopped expecting anything different. "Uncle frightens them." "Does he frighten you?" Lucy considered the question with the seriousness of someone twice her age. "No," she said finally. "He is only sad. People mistake it for something else." Clara thought of the man standing alone in the rain, staring up at a closed window, and felt something in her chest shift, quietly, the way ice shifts before it begins to crack. "Well," she said, standing and offering her hand, "I think it is far too gray a morning to sit inside feeling sad about it. Shall we find something more interesting to do?" For the first time, something like a smile touched the corner of Lucy's mouth, and she took Clara's hand. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Clara had not expected to find so easily. Lessons in the mornings, letters and numbers, and the kind of careful patience Lucy seemed to need more than any book could teach her. Walks in the afternoon, when the weather allowed, through gardens that had clearly once been beautifully kept, and now showed the first small signs of neglect, as though the man who owned them had simply stopped noticing whether they thrived or withered. She saw the Duke rarely in those first 2 weeks and always at a distance. He took his meals alone. He rode out early and returned late. The staff moved around his presence the way water moves around a stone, careful, silent, never quite touching. Clara noticed, though she said nothing of it, that even Mrs. Whitfield, who had run this household for longer than Clara had been alive, lowered her voice whenever the Duke's study door stood open. It was on the 15th day that Clara first crossed him properly. She had taken Lucy down to the stables that afternoon, against the nursemaid's mild protest, believing that a child who spent so much time alone with her thoughts might benefit from the noise and warmth of the horses. Lucy had lit up in a way Clara had not yet seen, laughing at the way one of the older mares nosed at her palm looking for sugar, and for a full hour the sadness that seemed to live permanently behind the girl's eyes had lifted entirely. They were still in the stables, Lucy perched on an overturned bucket feeding apple slices to the mare, when the Duke appeared in the doorway, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop the moment he stepped inside. "What is she doing here?" he said. It was not addressed to Lucy. His eyes were fixed on Clara. "Learning that horses are gentler than she has perhaps been told, Your Grace," Clara said, and did not look away, though she felt the nursemaid who had trailed behind them take a full step backward toward the door. "This is not a place for a child. There are risks here she does not understand." "With respect," Clara said, and she heard the nursemaid draw in a sharp breath at the words, as though she expected the ceiling to fall in. "I believe Lucy understands a great deal more than she is given credit for. She has been careful. She has been happy. I did not think either of those things was a risk worth avoiding." The Duke's jaw tightened. For a moment Clara thought she had gone too far, that she was about to become one more governess who did not last the month, and some quiet, stubborn part of her found that she did not much care. "Lucy," the Duke said, his voice softening only slightly, "come inside. It grows cold." Lucy looked between her uncle and Clara, the apple slice still in her hand, and to everyone's evident surprise she did not move at once. "Uncle," she said, "may Clara come too? I want to show you what Willow does when I hum to her." Something flickered across the Duke's face, so quickly that Clara might have imagined it, had she not been watching closely. It was not anger. It was something closer to the expression she had seen in the courtyard, that brief unguarded grief before the coldness closed back over it. "Another time," he said, and turned and left without another word. Later that evening, Clara was summoned to the study, and she went with her heart beating a little faster than she cared to admit, certain she was about to be dismissed. The room was dim, lit only by a low fire and a single lamp on the desk, and the Duke stood by the window with his back to the door when she entered. "You contradicted me," he said without turning around. "In front of the child, in front of the staff." "I did," Clara said. She saw no use in denying it. "Do you know what happens to servants in this house who speak to me that way?" "I imagine they are dismissed," Clara said, "or they leave on their own out of fear. I have heard as much from nearly everyone I have met here." He turned then and studied her in the lamplight with an expression she could not name, something between irritation and a kind of reluctant curiosity, as though she were a puzzle he had not expected to encounter in his own house. "And yet you do not seem afraid," he said. "I am not certain that is true," Clara admitted, "but I do not believe fear should decide how a child is raised. Lucy has lost enough, Your Grace. I did not think an hour with a gentle horse ought to be taken from her too." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Clara began to wonder if she should simply excuse herself. Then the Duke said, quietly, almost as if the words surprised him as much as they did her, "Her father was thrown from a horse 3 years ago. I was the one who insisted he ride that day, against his own better judgment, because I did not wish to hear his excuses. He did not survive the fall." Clara said nothing. She understood in that moment exactly what she had walked into that afternoon without knowing it, and exactly why the sight of Lucy so near the stables had struck something raw and unhealed in the man standing before her. "I am sorry," she said finally, and meant it entirely. "I did not know, but I do not think keeping her from every horse in England will bring him back, Your Grace, nor will it heal whatever it is you are carrying. It will only teach her that the world is full of things to be afraid of, and I do not believe that is a lesson you truly wish her to learn." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, some wall settling a fraction lower than it had been a moment before, though it did not fall entirely. "You may continue the lessons," he said finally, "but you will inform me before you take her near the stables again." "Of course, Your Grace. And Miss Bennet," he turned back toward the window as she reached the door, "thank you for making her laugh today. It has been some time since I heard that sound in this house." Clara left the study with her heart still beating fast, though for entirely different reasons than when she had entered it. She understood, walking back down the dim corridor toward her room, that she had just seen something no one else in the household had been permitted to see, a crack, however small, in the armor that had made every servant in this house lower their eyes and hold their breath. She did not yet understand what it would cost either of them, in the weeks to come, to keep that crack from closing over again. But she found, lying awake that night listening once more to the slow, even pacing down the corridor, that she wanted very much to be the reason it stayed open. Word of the exchange in the study did not stay contained within its walls, as such things rarely do in a household where every servant learns to read the mood of the house the way sailors read weather. By the following morning, Clara noticed a change in how the staff regarded her. Mrs. Whitfield, who had barely spoken to her beyond the necessary instructions of the household, brought her tea herself that morning instead of sending a maid, and lingered a moment longer than duty required. "You spoke back to him," the housekeeper said, not quite a question. "I did," Clara admitted, bracing herself for a scolding. Instead, Mrs. Whitfield's mouth twitched, something that might have become a smile if it had been given permission. "No one has done that since his brother died, miss. Not properly. Not in a way he listened to." She busied herself straightening a cloth that did not need straightening. "He was not always like this, you know. Cold, I mean. He was a hard man before, being the Duke breeds that into a person whether they wish it or not, but there was warmth under it. After the accident, the warmth went somewhere and never came back out." "What happened to him?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the shape of the answer if not its details. Mrs. Whitfield glanced toward the door, an old habit Clara had noticed in nearly every member of staff, and lowered her voice regardless of the fact that they were entirely alone. "His Grace blames himself for his brother's death, and rightly or wrongly, that blame has hardened into something he wears like armor. He believes that caring for people is what gets them hurt, or killed, or taken from him. So he has stopped allowing himself to care where he can help it, except for Miss Lucy. And he cannot even manage that properly, poor man, because every time he looks at her he sees her father's face." Clara thought of the closed window she had seen him staring up at on that first rainy evening, and the pacing she heard through the walls at night, and felt a fresh understanding settle over her, heavier and more complicated than pity. "There is also the matter of his cousin," Mrs. Whitfield added, dropping her voice further still. "Lord Edmund Carow. He visits more often than a man ought to visit a house he is not master of, and he is next in line for the title should anything happen to his Grace, seeing as Miss Lucy cannot inherit it herself, being a girl and her father gone. I do not trust him, miss, and I will say no more than that, for it is not my place, but I would advise you to keep your wits about you if ever he comes to call." Clara did not have to wait long to test that advice. Lord Carow arrived 4 days later, on a bright afternoon that felt entirely at odds with the tension his arrival brought into the house. He was a handsome man in the way that certain paintings are handsome, all pleasant symmetry and careful charm, with none of the weight that sat behind the Duke's eyes. He greeted the staff with an easy familiarity that Clara found, without quite knowing why, more unsettling than the Duke's coldness had ever been. She met him properly in the garden, where she had taken Lucy to practice her letters in the last of the afternoon sun. Lord Carow strolled toward them with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed every space he entered belonged to him by right. "And who is this delightful addition to the household?" he asked, his eyes moving over Clara in a way that made her want to step between him and Lucy without quite understanding the impulse. "Clara Bennet, my lord. I have the honor of teaching Miss Lucy." "Bennet," he repeated, as though testing the name for some hidden meaning. "I do not believe I have heard the name before, and where do the Bennets hail from, may I ask?" "Yorkshire, my lord," Clara said, though she offered nothing further, and something in his expression suggested he had noted the omission. "How fortunate for my cousin to find such a capable young woman willing to bury herself out here in the countryside." His smile did not reach his eyes. "Netherby has always had trouble keeping good staff. People find the atmosphere here rather trying, shall we say." "I have found it perfectly welcoming, my lord," Clara said evenly. "Have you?" He studied her a moment longer, and Clara had the distinct sense of being weighed and measured for some purpose she could not yet see. "Well, I am sure a woman of your evident good sense will know precisely how far to involve herself in matters that do not concern her." He turned to Lucy then, his voice shifting into something falsely bright. "And how is my dear little cousin? Learning her letters, I see. Wonderful." Every young lady should know how to write a proper letter, though I do wonder who she shall have occasion to write to, buried out here as she is." Lucy shrank back against Clara's side without a word, and Clara felt the girl's small hand tighten around a fold of her skirt. She did not need to be told that Lucy disliked this man, nor did she think it took much imagination to guess why. "If you'll forgive us, my lord," Clara said, "Miss Lucy's lesson is not yet finished, and the light will not last much longer." Something flickered across Lord Carrow's face, gone before she could name it, and then the pleasant mask returned as easily as it had slipped. "Of course. Do give my regards to my cousin. Tell him I look forward to speaking with him this evening, on a matter of some importance." He bowed, shallow and mocking, and strolled away toward the house. That night dinner was served in a silence so heavy that even the clink of silverware seemed an intrusion. Clara, invited for the first time to dine with the family now that Lord Carrow was present, watched the two men across the table with the growing understanding that whatever business had brought Lord Carrow to Netherby, it was not the pleasant social call he pretended it to be. "The estate at Ferncroft continues to lose money," Lord Carrow said, cutting into his meat with unnecessary precision. "I have told you before, cousin, that the tenants there need a firmer hand. You have grown soft toward them, letting rents lapse, forgiving debts. It reflects poorly on the family. The tenants at Ferncroft lost their harvest to flooding last autumn," the Duke said, without looking up. "I will not bleed a starving family for the sake of appearances, Edmund. If that makes me soft in your estimation, I can bear the insult. It is not merely my estimation you should concern yourself with. There are those in London who whisper that you have grown strange since Edward's death, withdrawn, unpredictable. It would be a simple thing, cousin, for such whispers to grow into something more troublesome, should certain parties decide the title might be better served in steadier hands." The Duke set down his knife with a precision that was somehow more alarming than if he had slammed it. "Is that a threat, Edmund?" "It is an observation, offered out of family concern, nothing more." Lord Carrow's smile did not waver, though Clara noticed his eyes flicked briefly toward her, as though gauging whether she understood the true weight of what was being said beneath the polite words. "You would do well to remember that Lucy's guardianship, and the management of her father's estate, rests entirely on your continued good standing. Should anyone question your fitness, in mind or otherwise, there are legal avenues by which a closer relation might petition for her care instead." The room went very still. Clara saw the Duke's hand curl slowly into a fist upon the table, and for a moment she feared the careful control he wore like a second skin might finally break in front of her. But when he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it, and somehow more dangerous for its calm. "You will not go near that child, Edmund. Not now, not ever, not while there is breath left in me to prevent it. Is that understood?" Lord Carrow spread his hands in a gesture of wounded innocence. "I only wish to help, cousin, but do consider what I've said. Grief has a way of making men careless with the things that matter most. It would be a terrible shame to lose everything simply because you were too proud to accept that you needed guidance." He rose from the table, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. "I shall stay the week, if it is no trouble. There are papers regarding the northern properties I wish to review while I am here." After he had gone, the silence in the dining room stretched long and heavy. Lucy, who had been sent to bed before the worst of the conversation, had at least been spared it, but Clara had heard every word, and she understood now, with a clarity that settled cold in her stomach, exactly what kind of danger circled this family beneath its grand and gloomy roof. "He means to take her," the Duke said finally, so quietly Clara almost missed it. "If he can find any excuse at all, any at all, he will use it to take her from me and control her inheritance until she comes of age. And I cannot say with certainty that the law would side with me over him, not if he brings enough whispers to enough ears in London." "Then we shall have to make certain he finds no excuse," Clara said. The Duke looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way he had not before, as though surprised to find her still sitting there, still willing to say we as though she had any part in this at all. "Why do you concern yourself with this?" he asked. You have known this family a fortnight, you owe us nothing." Clara considered her answer carefully before she gave it. "Because Lucy has had enough taken from her already, your grace. And because I do not think a man who rode through a storm to save a stranger on the road, and who blames himself so thoroughly for grief that was never entirely his to carry, deserves to lose the one piece of his family he has left, simply because he has forgotten how to ask for help defending her." Something moved behind the Duke's eyes, some wall shifting, not falling but shifting, the way stone shifts before it finally gives way to water. "You are a strange woman, Miss Bennet," he said, and there was no coldness in it at all. "So I have been told, your grace," Clara said, usually as a warning. For the first time since she had arrived at Netherby Hall, she saw something that might, in a kinder light, have been called the beginning of a smile. Lord Carrow did not leave within the week he had promised. He lingered, finding one excuse after another, papers that needed further review, whether too poor for travel, a sudden interest in the state of the eastern fields that required, in his words, a more thorough inspection than a single visit could allow. Clara watched him move through the house with the patient ease of a man who believed time was on his side, and she found herself growing more watchful with each day that passed, though she could not always say exactly what she was watching for. It was on one such evening, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, that Clara woke well past midnight to the sound of something breaking down the corridor. She sat up at once, her heart hammering, and reached for the shawl at the foot of her bed before stepping out into the hall. The sound had come from the eastern wing, the same wing that housed the closed room she had noticed on her first evening at Netherby Hall, the room whose window the Duke had stood staring up at in the rain. A thin line of lamplight showed beneath its door, though she had never once seen it opened in all her weeks in the house. She hesitated only a moment before knocking, softly, half expecting no answer at all. "Your Grace." There was a long silence, long enough that she nearly turned away, convinced she had imagined the sound entirely. Then the door opened, and the Duke stood before her in shirt-sleeves, his hair disordered, his eyes holding an expression so raw and unguarded that Clara felt, for a moment, as though she were intruding on something sacred. Behind him, she could see into the room for the first time. It was a young man's bedroom, kept exactly as it must have been left 3 years before, a writing crop still hanging by the door, a half-finished letter still sitting on the writing desk, gathering dust. On the floor near the window lay the shattered remains of a small glass figure of a horse, clearly knocked from the desk in some moment of grief or anger that Clara had interrupted mid-motion. "I did not mean to wake anyone," the Duke said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual careful control. "Go back to bed, Miss Bennet. This does not concern you." "I heard something break," Clara said gently, "and I was concerned, that is all." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his composure seemed to simply give way, the way a dam gives way not all at once but in a single, final crack that the rest follows through. This was his room, the Duke said, and though he did not step aside to invite her in, he did not close the door either. "Edwards, I have not been able to bring myself to change a single thing in it. I come here some nights and I sit, and I try to remember his voice, and some nights I cannot, and it frightens me more than anything in this world, that I might forget the sound of my own brother's voice." Clara stepped forward, carefully, and knelt to gather the broken pieces of the little glass horse from the floor before he could stop her. "You don't have to remember him alone," she said, not looking up from her task, giving him the mercy of not having to hold her gaze while he stood so unguarded before her. "Grief carried alone grows heavier every year. I do not think that is a fault in you, your Grace. I think it is only a very human kind of pain." "I told him to ride that horse," the Duke said, so quietly she almost did not hear it over the sound of glass clinking gently in her palm. "He did not want to. He said the animal was too spirited, that he had a bad feeling about it that morning, and I laughed at him. I called him a coward in front of the stable hands in front of Carrow, who was visiting that week as well. I did it because I was young and proud, and I did not understand yet that words like that could not be taken back. He rode the horse to prove he was not afraid of it, and the animal threw him not a mile from this house, and he died before the physician could even be summoned. His voice cracked just slightly on the final word. I killed my own brother with pride, Miss Bennet, and I have spent every day since trying to make certain I never again say a careless word to someone I love, because I have learned precisely what such words can cost. Clara rose slowly, the broken pieces of glass cradled carefully in her hand, and looked at him with an expression that held no pity at all, only a kind of steady understanding that seemed to unsettle him more than pity would have. You did not put him on that horse, Your Grace, she said. Pride is not the same as murder, however much guilt might try to convince you otherwise in the small hours of the night. You were young and careless, as young men often are, and a terrible accident followed words that were never meant to cause harm. That is a tragedy. It is not a crime, and I do not think you will ever heal from it so long as you continue to sentence yourself for something that was never truly your doing. You speak as though healing were a simple thing. I never said it was simple, Clara said. Only that it is possible. I have seen you with Lucy, Your Grace. I have seen the way you watch over this house, this family, even when it costs you every ounce of warmth you might otherwise show the world. That is not the behavior of a man without a heart. It is the behavior of a man who is so afraid of losing what remains of it that he has locked it away where nothing can touch it. But locked away is not the same as gone. He was silent for a long time, standing in the doorway of his dead brother's room with the lamplight throwing long shadows across his face, and Clara did not move, did not fill the silence with anything further, understanding instinctively that some moments needed room to simply exist without being crowded by more words. Why do you speak to me this way? He asked finally, when everyone else in this house speaks to me as though I might shatter, or as though they might shatter simply for standing too near. Because I do not think you are made of glass, Your Grace, Clara said, setting the broken pieces of the little horse gently on the writing desk. I think you have simply been alone with your grief for far too long, and no one has been brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to tell you that you do not have to carry it entirely by yourself. Something in his face shifted then, not quite a smile, but something close to it, a kind of exhausted gratitude that made him look, for the first time since she had met him, less like the fearsome Duke of Netherby and more simply like a man who had been carrying too much for too long. You should return to bed, Miss Bennet, he said, though his voice had lost every trace of the coldness it usually carried. It grows late, and Lucy will want you rested for her lessons. Yes, Your Grace. She turned to go, then paused at the door and looked back at him. For what it is worth, I think your brother would be proud of the man you have become, however hard you find that to believe. Lucy speaks of you with more love than fear, whatever the rest of the house might whisper. That is not nothing. She left him standing there in the doorway of the room he could not bring himself to change, and though she did not look back again, she thought she heard, just before she turned the corner into her own corridor, the soft sound of a door closing gently, for what might have been the first time in 3 years. The following morning, Lord Carrow found her in the garden and remarked, with a lightness that did not quite hide the sharpness beneath it, that she seemed to be spending a great deal of time in conversation with his cousin of late. Servants ought to know their place, Miss Bennet, he said, strolling alongside her with his hands clasped behind his back. I would hate to see a young woman of your evident intelligence mistake temporary kindness for something more lasting. My cousin is not a man given to sentiment. Whatever warmth you believe you have found in him, I assure you, it will not survive the first real test. I have not asked for your assurance, my lord, Clara said, keeping her eyes forward. No, Lord Carrow agreed, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, but you shall have it regardless. Consider it a kindness, from one who knows him rather better than you do. He left her then, and Clara walked the rest of the garden path alone, turning his words over carefully, aware that whatever game Lord Carrow was playing, she had somehow, without quite meaning to, become a piece upon his board. News arrived a week later that the Duke had been invited to a gathering at Lord Ashcombe's estate, a formal affair meant to celebrate the coming of spring, though Clara suspected, from the careful way Mrs. Whitfield spoke of it, that such invitations were rare enough that refusing this one might draw more attention than accepting it. Lucy was to accompany him, along with Clara, whose presence had quietly become expected in matters concerning the child, though no one had ever formally announced it. "You will want a proper dress for it," Mrs. Whitfield said, eyeing Clara's modest wardrobe with a critical frown. "Society out here is a small, watchful thing, miss, and they will judge you the moment you step through the door, whether that is fair or not." The dress that arrived 2 days later, delivered by a seamstress from the nearest town, was finer than anything Clara had ever owned. A deep blue that Mrs. Whitfield insisted, with a knowing look Clara chose not to examine too closely, had been paid for by the Duke himself, though no note or explanation accompanied it. Clara wore it with a strange mixture of gratitude and unease, aware that such a gift, however practical its purpose, would not go unnoticed by the very society it was meant to help her navigate. The gathering at Ashcombe was everything Mrs. Whitfield had warned her it would be. The great hall glittered with candlelight and the low murmur of 100 conversations, and Clara felt the weight of curious eyes upon her from the moment she entered at Lucy's side, one step behind the Duke, close enough to be noticed, far enough to remain properly in her place. She heard her own name whispered before an hour had passed. She heard, too, whispers of another kind, the sort that traveled faster and further than any truth could hope to catch them. "They say he keeps her closer than a governess ought to be kept," one woman murmured to another, not quite quietly enough, behind a painted fan. "Quite improper, if you ask me, a man of his standing and a woman of such humble origins." "I heard she has some hold over him," another voice added, dripping with the particular relish certain people reserve for another's misfortune. "Lord Caro said as much to my husband only last week. Said the Duke has grown quite strange since her arrival. Unpredictable. One does wonder what sort of influence she wields to unsettle a man so thoroughly." Clara kept her face carefully still, though the words landed like small stones against her composure. She had not realized, until that moment, exactly how far Lord Caro's whispers had already traveled, nor how carefully he had shaped them to serve his own purposes. A woman approached her not long after, older, dressed in a severe gray that matched the sharpness of her expression, and introduced herself as Lady Prescott, an old acquaintance of the family, though her tone suggested the acquaintance had never been particularly warm. "You are the governess," Lady Prescott said, without preamble. "I will offer you a piece of advice, Miss Bennet, since it seems no one else in that household has troubled themselves to do so. The Duke of Netherby is not a man who can be redeemed by a pretty face and a soft word, whatever you may have convinced yourself of these past weeks. He has buried a brother, and grief has made him strange, and I have watched men like him before. They draw people close only to push them away again once the novelty fades, and they leave nothing but wreckage behind them. You would do well to remember your position, and to guard your heart accordingly before it is too badly bruised." "I appreciate the concern, my lady," Clara said carefully, "but I have not come here seeking anything from His Grace beyond fair employment, and I do not intend to let idle talk shape how I conduct myself." "Idle talk," Lady Prescott repeated, with a thin, humorless smile. "My dear girl, do you truly believe it is idle? Lord Caro has been quite thorough in his concern for his cousin's welfare. He has spoken to several members of the family court about the Duke's fitness to continue as Lucy's guardian, citing his increasingly erratic behavior, his refusal to attend to estate matters as he once did, his sudden and unexplained attachment to a governess of no particular family or fortune. Such things build, Miss Bennet, whether you wish them to or not, and when they build high enough, they become very difficult indeed to tear back down." Clara felt the floor shift slightly beneath her, though she kept her expression composed through sheer effort of will. She found the Duke across the room a moment later, standing near the fireplace in conversation with Lord Ashcombe, his face wearing its usual mask of cold composure, though she could see, now that she knew him well enough to look for it, the faint tightness at the corner of his jaw that suggested he, too, had heard some version of the whispers moving through the room. Lucy found her not long after, tugging at her sleeve with the wide, worried eyes of a child, who understands more of an adult conversation than the adults around her would like to believe. "Clara," she whispered, "why is everyone looking at us like that?" "They are simply curious, dear one," Clara said gently, crouching to Lucy's level despite the fine dress she wore. "Grown-ups do enjoy their gossip, I'm afraid, especially at parties such as this. Pay it no mind." But Lucy's small face remained troubled, and Clara understood with a fresh ache in her chest that even a child of 7 could sense the danger circling closer. However carefully, the adults around her tried to shield it from view. It was later that evening, as the gathering began to thin and carriages were called for departing guests, that Clara found herself briefly alone in a quiet alcove near the garden doors, and Lord Carow appeared beside her as though he had been waiting for precisely this opportunity. "You seem troubled, Miss Bennet," he said, his voice carrying its familiar pleasant menace. "I do hope the evening's conversation has not proven too unsettling." "I am quite well, my lord." "Of course." He smiled and glanced briefly toward the fireplace where the Duke still stood, now speaking with a group of gentlemen whose expressions suggested the topic of conversation was not a comfortable one. "I confess, I did not expect you to prove quite so resilient. Most young women in your position, faced with the sort of scrutiny you are now under, would have already begun packing their bags. It speaks well of your character, I suppose, though it does complicate matters rather considerably for me." "Complicate what matters exactly?" "Come now, Miss Bennet, let us not pretend either of us is entirely ignorant of the game being played here." His voice dropped lower, losing its pleasant veneer for just a moment, revealing something colder and more calculating beneath. "My cousin is not fit to raise that child, whatever affection you may have convinced yourself he holds for her. He is unstable, unpredictable. A man haunted by guilt he refuses to release, prone to fits of temper and long silences that no physician has ever properly examined. I intend to see Lucy placed under guardianship that will actually serve her interests, and I intend to see the Netherby estates managed by someone with a clearer head for business than my cousin has shown in years. You, Miss Bennet, are an inconvenience to that plan, a witness whose testimony to his supposed stability might prove troublesome should this matter reach the courts. I would advise you, quite sincerely, to consider your own future rather more carefully than you have thus far." "Is that a threat, my lord?" "It is a kindness," Lord Carow said, echoing the very words he had used weeks before, "offered to a young woman who has clearly grown rather too fond of a household that is not, and never will be, truly hers. I would hate to see you caught beneath the wreckage when it finally comes down." He bowed then, shallow and mocking as ever, and left her standing alone in the alcove with his words settling cold and heavy in her chest. She understood, watching him melt back into the glittering crowd with the easy confidence of a man who believed his victory already secured, that whatever quiet peace had begun to grow at Netherby Hall was now under a threat far more dangerous than either she or the Duke had yet fully reckoned with. The carriage ride home was quiet, Lucy asleep against Clara's shoulder, the Duke sitting across from them with his eyes fixed on the dark countryside sliding past the window, his expression unreadable in the dim lantern light. "You heard them," he said finally, not looking away from the window. "The whispers." "I did, your grace." "And what do you make of them?" Clara considered her answer carefully, aware of the sleeping child between them, aware too of how much weight her words might carry in a man who had spent so long believing himself unworthy of anyone's steady regard. "I make of them exactly what they are," she said. "Fear dressed up as concern, ambition dressed up as family duty. I do not believe a single word Lord Carow has whispered about you tonight, your grace, and I do not think you should either." "He has friends in the family court," the Duke said quietly. "Judges who owe him favors, men who will listen to whatever version of events serves their own interests best. It would not take much, Miss Bennet, for him to build a case convincing enough to see Lucy taken from me." "Then we shall have to make certain he cannot," Clara said, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel but was determined to project regardless. "Whatever it takes, your grace, I do not intend to let that man win simply because he is louder and more practiced at cruelty than either of us cares to be." The Duke turned from the window then and looked at her for a long moment in the dim, swaying light of the carriage, and though he said nothing further for the remainder of the journey, Clara thought she saw, in the set of his shoulders, something that had not been there before. Not quite hope, but perhaps, at last, the smallest willingness to believe that hope might still be possible. The weeks that followed brought a strange, uneasy quiet to Netherby Hall, the kind of quiet that settles over a house before a storm, when even the servants seem to sense that something is coming, though no one can yet say what shape it will take. Lord Carrow returned to London, but his absence brought no relief. Letters began arriving with increasing frequency, addressed to the Duke's solicitor, to the local magistrate, to acquaintances in the family court, and though Clara never saw their contents directly, she watched the toll they took on the Duke's face each time Mr. Finch, the estate's steward, delivered another with careful, apologetic hands. "He is building his case," the Duke told her one evening, the two of them sitting in the study long after Lucy had gone to bed, a habit that had grown between them without either quite acknowledging when it had begun. "Slowly, methodically. He is not a man given to rash action, Miss Bennet, which makes him more dangerous, not less. He will not strike until he is certain of the outcome." "Then we must be certain of our own footing before he does," Clara said. "What does he actually have against you? Not whispers, evidence. What could he bring before a court that might actually hold weight?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded before him on the desk, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she had come to recognize as the sound of a truth he did not enjoy admitting. "There was a period after Edward's death when I did not leave this house for the better part of a year," he said. "I did not attend to estate business. I did not answer letters. I drank more than any man should, and there were nights I do not fully remember, nights the staff have never spoken of to anyone outside these walls. Out of loyalty I have done little to earn. If Edmund has found even one servant willing to speak of that time, dressed up in the right language before the right magistrate, it would not be difficult to paint a picture of a man unfit to raise a child." "But that was grief," Clara said. "Grief, your grace, not madness. Any physician worth his training would recognize the difference." "Physicians can be paid to see whatever their patron wishes them to see," the Duke said grimly. "Edmund has money enough and connections enough to find one willing to write whatever report best serves his purpose." Clara sat with that for a long moment, turning the problem over as though it were a puzzle box that simply required the right pressure applied in the right place. "Then we do not fight him on the ground he has chosen," she said finally. "We do not wait for him to bring his accusations to a court already primed to believe them. We find our own evidence first. Proof of his ambition, proof that his concern for Lucy has always been concern for the title and nothing more. If we can show the court that his motives are self-serving, his accusations will carry far less weight, whatever grief he manages to dredge up from your past." "And how do you propose we find such proof?" "I do not know yet," Clara admitted. "But I do not believe a man as careful as Lord Carrow has been entirely careful in every corner of his life. Ambitious men rarely are. Somewhere there will be a thread to pull." It was Mrs. Whitfield, in the end, who provided the first thread, though she did not realize its significance until Clara pressed her gently for details one quiet afternoon in the kitchen. "There was a maid," Mrs. Whitfield said, frowning as she tried to recall details from years past. "Before your time, miss, and before Lord Edward's passing too, if I recall it right. A girl named Susan who worked in the Eastern Wing. She left rather suddenly, and there was talk, though nothing ever proven, that Lord Carrow had taken an interest in her that was not entirely proper, and that when she refused him, he saw to it she was dismissed on some invented pretext before she could cause him trouble. I always thought it a shame. She was a good girl, careful with her work. Do you know where she went?" "I heard she found a position in the next county with a family named Hartley, though I could not say if she remains there still. It has been some years, miss." It took Clara the better part of a week, corresponding carefully through the postal service and enlisting the discreet help of Mr. Finch, to track down the woman in question, now working as a housekeeper in her own right for a modest family 2 counties distant. The letter that eventually arrived in response, cautious and hesitant at first, gradually unfolded into a fuller account, one that confirmed everything Mrs. Whitfield had suspected, and a good deal more besides, details of Lord Carrow's behavior that painted a picture entirely at odds with the concerned, dutiful cousin he presented to the world. But it was Lucy, in the end, who provided the piece that would matter most, though none of them could have anticipated it would come from a child so young. She came to Clara's room late one evening, unable to sleep, and curled up beside her on the bed, the way she had taken to doing on nights when the shadows in her own room felt too heavy to bear alone. "Clara," she said softly after a long silence, "may I tell you something? Uncle Edmund told me not to, but I don't like keeping secrets from you." Clara's heart quickened, though she kept her voice carefully gentle. "Of course you may, dear one, you may always tell me anything. When he visited last before the party, he took me for a walk in the garden and he asked me lots of questions, about Uncle Gideon, whether he ever shouted or seemed sad for a long time or forgot things. He told me it was important I remember everything and tell it to a man who would come to visit soon, a doctor, he said, who wanted to make sure Uncle was well. He gave me a sweet and told me it would be our secret." Lucy's small face crumpled with worry. "I didn't like it, Clara. It felt wrong somehow, even though I couldn't say why." Clara held the girl close, her mind racing even as she kept her voice soothing and calm. "You did nothing wrong, Lucy, and you were very brave to tell me. I promise you nothing bad will come of it. Now try to sleep, my dear. I will make certain everything is looked after." She went to the Duke's study the moment Lucy had drifted off, and relayed everything the child had told her, watching his face darken with a fury more controlled and more frightening than anything she had yet witnessed in him. "He means to coach her," the Duke said, his voice low and tight. "To have her repeat whatever damning account he has planted in her mind, before a physician he has already paid to find whatever conclusion suits him. He would use my own niece against me, Miss Bennet, without a moment's hesitation, if it served his purpose." "Then we must move before he does," Clara said. "We have Susan Hartley's letter. We have Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Finch, and every member of this household who has watched you these past months and seen nothing but a man doing his careful, exhausted best for a grieving child. We have Lucy's own account of what he asked of her tonight, which any honest court would recognize as manipulation rather than concern. It is time, Your Grace, to stop waiting for Lord Carrow to make his move, and to make one of our own instead." The Duke looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful moving behind his eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, Clara saw him not as the cold, feared Duke of Netherby that all of England whispered about, but simply as a man who had, after 3 years of carrying his grief entirely alone, finally found someone willing to stand beside him and help him carry it instead. "I do not know how to thank you for this," he said quietly. "You do not need to thank me, Your Grace," Clara said. "I only ask that you trust me when the time comes to see it through." "I do," he said, and the simplicity of the words carried more weight than any grand declaration could have managed. "I trust you, Clara, more than I have trusted anyone in a very long time." It was the first time he had used her given name, and though neither of them remarked upon it, something passed between them in that quiet study, unspoken but unmistakable, the first fragile thread of something neither of them had expected to find in the wreckage of grief and fear that had brought them together. Lord Carrow arrived at Netherby Hall 8 days later, unannounced, with a physician Clara had never seen before trailing behind him, and a document already prepared, requiring only the signatures of witnesses to set its contents into motion. The Duke received them in the great hall rather than the study, a deliberate choice, Clara suspected, meant to ensure that the confrontation, whatever shape it took, would happen in view of enough witnesses that nothing could later be twisted or denied. "Cousin," Lord Carrow said, his pleasant mask firmly in place, though Clara noticed a new tightness around his eyes that suggested he sensed, perhaps, that the ground beneath his careful plan was less solid than he had believed. I have brought Dr. Ellery with me, at the recommendation of the family court, to conduct a proper assessment of your fitness to continue as Lucy's guardian. I am certain, if you have nothing to hide, you will have no objection to cooperating fully." "I have no objection at all," the Duke said, with a calm that Clara knew, from having watched him closely these past months, took considerable effort to maintain. "Though I would ask, before Dr. Ellery begins whatever assessment he intends, that we first address the manner in which you have been gathering your evidence, Edmund, including the questions you put to a 7-year-old child in my garden 3 weeks ago, questions you instructed her to keep secret from the very people responsible for her welfare." Lord Carrow's composure flickered just slightly. "I do not know what you mean." "I believe you do," the Duke said, and gestured toward the staircase, where Clara now descended with Lucy's hand held gently in her own, and Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Finch following a step behind, each carrying with careful hands the documents Clara had spent the better part of 2 weeks quietly assembling. "Lucy," Clara said gently, crouching beside the girl though every eye in the hall was now fixed upon them, "will you tell your uncle and Lord Carrow what you told me the other night? You are not in any trouble, dear one. You need only tell the truth." Lucy's small chin trembled, but she straightened her shoulders with a courage that made Clara's chest ache with pride, and looked directly at Lord Carrow as she spoke. "You asked me to remember things and tell them to a doctor. You said it was a secret. You gave me a sweet so I would remember to do it. I did not want to keep secrets from Clara, so I told her instead." The color drained from Lord Carrow's face, though he recovered quickly, forcing his pleasant smile back into place. A child's memory of a casual conversation, twisted, no doubt, by an ambitious governess eager to secure her own position in this household. Hardly the stuff of legal evidence. "Perhaps not on its own," the Duke said, and nodded to Mr. Finch, who stepped forward and laid the gathered documents upon the long table at the center of the hall. "But combined with a sworn account from a former housemaid, describing rather thoroughly the circumstances of her dismissal from this house some years ago, and the improper attentions that preceded it, I suspect a magistrate might find the pattern considerably more troubling than a single child's memory alone." Lord Carrow's eyes moved over the documents with growing alarm, and Clara watched the careful architecture of his plan begin, at last, to crumble. "You cannot prove any of this," he said, though the confidence had gone entirely from his voice. "Perhaps not to the standard of a criminal court," the Duke said, stepping closer, and though his voice remained level, there was something in it now that made even Lord Carrow take an unconscious step backward. "But I do not need a criminal conviction, Edmund. I need only enough doubt cast upon your motives that no magistrate in England will grant you guardianship of a child whose inheritance you have spent 3 years quietly maneuvering to control. And I believe, given what stands upon this table, that doubt has been rather thoroughly established." The physician, who had said nothing throughout the entire exchange, cleared his throat awkwardly and gathered his bag. "I believe, my lord, that I have seen quite enough to satisfy my own conscience in this matter. I will not be putting my name to any assessment today." He offered the Duke a small, apologetic bow and let himself out, leaving Lord Carrow alone in the center of the hall, stripped, for the first time, of every ally he had brought with him. "This is not finished," Lord Carrow said, his voice tight with a fury that had nothing pleasant left in it at all. "I will find another physician, another witness. You cannot hide behind a governess and a housekeeper's gossip forever, Gideon." "You may try, Edmund," the Duke said quietly. "But I would advise you to consider very carefully what it will cost you, should this household's account of your conduct these past 3 years become known more widely than the walls of this hall. I have been patient with you, out of respect for family ties that clearly mean nothing to you at all. That patience has now ended. Leave my house, and do not return unless it is with an apology for the child you frightened and the family you have spent years attempting to tear apart." For a long, taut moment, Clara thought Lord Carrow might argue further, might find some final cutting remark to salvage his dignity as he left. But he only looked around the hall once more, at the Duke standing tall and unyielding, at Clara with her hand still resting protectively on Lucy's shoulder, at the assembled staff, whose loyalty had, in the end, proven far stronger than his money or his charm, and he turned and walked out without another word, his footsteps echoing hollow across the marble floor until the great doors closed behind him. The hall exhaled as one, a collective release of breath that had been held, in truth, for far longer than that single confrontation. Mrs. Whitfield pressed a hand to her chest. Mr. Finch allowed himself a rare, relieved smile. Lucy, released at last from the terrible tension of the moment, buried her face against Clara's skirts and began, quietly, to cry, though this time it was the ordinary crying of a frightened child finally allowed to feel safe again, rather than the flat, hollow sadness Clara had grown so used to seeing in her. It should have felt like a victory entirely without shadow. But that evening, when Clara sought out the Duke in his study, expecting to find him settled at last into something like peace, she found instead a man standing once again by the window, his shoulders tight with a tension that had not left him despite the day's success. "Your Grace, you should not stay," he said without turning around. Clara stopped short, the words landing like a physical blow. "I beg your pardon." Edmund will not simply retreat, Clara. He will regroup. He will find new angles, new weaknesses, and I fear that you, having proven yourself so thoroughly capable of undoing his plans, will become his primary target the next time he attempts this. I have already cost one person I loved their life through my own carelessness. I will not be the cause of harm coming to you as well. He turned to face her at last, and his expression had returned to the cold, distant mask she had not seen on him in weeks, the very same mask that had made all of England fear him, now deployed, she realized with a fresh ache, as a shield against his own fear of losing her. "I think it best you seek a position elsewhere, somewhere Edmund's reach cannot follow you. I will provide whatever reference and compensation you require." "You are frightened," Clara said quietly, and it was not a question. "I am being practical." "No," Clara said, taking a step closer, refusing to let the cold mask deter her the way it had deterred every other soul in this household from the very first day she had arrived. "You are frightened, not of Edmund, of this." She gestured gently at the space between them, at the months of careful, hard-won trust that had grown there. "You believe that if you care for me, truly care, you will lose me the way you lost your brother. And so you have decided it is safer to push me away before that loss can happen on its own. I understand that fear, Your Grace. I have watched it live behind your eyes since the day you saved me on that road. But I will not let you send me away simply because loving someone, even in the quiet, ordinary way that friendship becomes something more, terrifies you more than any highwayman ever could." He said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes bright with something he was clearly fighting hard not to let surface. "You do not have to be afraid of being known," Clara said softly, the words simple and unadorned, carrying nothing of grandeur or performance, only the plain, quiet truth of what she had come to understand about him these past months. "I have seen you, Gideon, not the Duke that all of England fears. You. And I am not leaving." The silence that followed felt as though the entire house held its breath alongside them. And then, slowly, the careful, cold armor that had protected Gideon Ashwood, Duke of Netherby, for 3 long years of solitary grief, finally, fully, began to fall away. He crossed the small distance between them and took her hands in his, and Clara felt them tremble, this man who had faced down armed highwaymen without a flicker of fear, whose very name made grown men lower their eyes, now standing before her with his composure entirely undone. "I do not know how to do this," he admitted, his voice rough with an honesty she had never heard him allow himself before. "I have spent 3 years teaching myself that caring for someone only leads to losing them. I do not know how to simply let myself feel this, without the fear pressing in immediately behind it." "Then let us learn together," Clara said. "I am not asking you to stop being afraid, Gideon. I am only asking you not to let the fear decide everything for you. There is a difference between caution and closing yourself away entirely, and I think, somewhere beneath all that armor, you already know it." He lifted a hand slowly, as though asking permission, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with the fearsome reputation that had followed him across every county in England. "All my life," he said quietly, "I have been taught that a duke does not kneel. Not before God in public, not before his tenants, certainly not before a woman he has known scarcely 3 months. And yet I find myself wanting to do exactly that, Clara Bennet, if only you would allow it." "I would allow a great many things from you, your grace," Clara said, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw him laugh, quiet and surprised, as though the sound itself had grown unfamiliar to him through long disuse. He did not kneel that night. It would come later, in a moment far more public and far more binding than either of them could have anticipated that quiet evening in the study. But something settled between them nonetheless, an understanding as steady and certain as the stone walls of Netherby Hall itself, and Clara went to bed that night with a lightness in her chest she had not known she was capable of feeling. The weeks that followed brought Lord Carrow's final, desperate attempt to salvage his scheme, though it proved, in the end, considerably less formidable than his earlier campaign of careful whispers had been. He attempted to bring his case before the family court regardless, armed with nothing more than his own testimony and a handful of vague insinuations, and found himself met by a magistrate already well briefed, thanks to careful correspondence the Duke's solicitor had conducted in the weeks prior, on the character of both parties involved. Susan Hartley's sworn account, delivered in careful, dignified language that left no doubt as to its truth, proved the final blow to whatever credibility Lord Carrow had hoped to salvage. The court dismissed his petition entirely, and further, given the pattern of conduct now laid bare before them, saw fit to strip him of his position as next in line for the Netherby title, a role that passed instead, by careful legal arrangement the Duke set in motion within the month, to a distant but far more honorable branch of the family, ensuring that whatever ambition had driven Lord Carrow these past years would never again find purchase in Lucy's inheritance. Lord Carrow left England not long after, his reputation too damaged to sustain the life he had grown accustomed to, and Netherby Hall, for the first time in 3 years, settled into a quiet that held no undercurrent of dread beneath it. It was Lady Ashcombe, ever eager for an occasion to display her own social standing, who insisted upon hosting a summer ball to celebrate what she called, with more accuracy than she perhaps intended, the restoration of the Netherby family's good standing. The Duke had little interest in such gatherings under ordinary circumstances, but he accepted the invitation this time without hesitation, and Clara, watching him dress that evening with a care he had not shown for any social occasion since her arrival, suspected he had some particular purpose in mind that he had not yet chosen to share with her. The hall glittered that night much as it had months before, when whispers of scandal had followed Clara through every room she entered. But the whispers tonight carried a different weight entirely, curiosity rather than cruelty, as guests who had once looked upon her with suspicion now watched the Duke of Netherby cross the crowded floor toward her with an intent so plain that even the most oblivious observer could not mistake it. "Your Grace," Clara said, dropping into the small curtsy that propriety demanded, though her heart had already begun to race at the look in his eyes. "Miss Bennet," he said, and there was warmth in the formal address now, a private joke between them that no one else in the room could fully understand. "Might I have this dance?" They moved through the steps together, and for a while Clara allowed herself simply to enjoy it, the music, the candlelight, the steady warmth of his hand at her waist, so different from the cold, distant man who had once ridden past her without offering his hand to help her from the mud. But partway through the dance, the music faltered, and Clara realized with a start that the Duke had signaled the musicians to stop entirely. The room's murmur of conversation died away as every eye turned toward them, and Clara felt a rush of heat climb her cheeks as she understood, all at once, exactly what was about to happen. Gideon Ashwood, Duke of Netherby, the man all of England had spent 3 years learning to fear, sank slowly to one knee in the middle of Lord Ashcombe's grand ballroom, before every member of society who had once whispered so cruelly of the strange attachment growing between a duke and his niece's governess. "I have spent a great deal of my life being feared," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room, steady despite the vulnerability of his position, kneeling before all of England with his heart laid entirely bare. "I built that fear carefully, brick by brick, because I believed it would keep me safe from ever again losing someone I loved. It very nearly cost me everything that still mattered, my niece, my own capacity for happiness, and very nearly you as well, Clara, before I found the courage to set it down." He reached into his coat and produced a small ring, simple rather than ostentatious, and held it toward her with a steadiness that belied the trembling she could see in the set of his jaw. "You told me once that I did not have to be afraid of being known. I have thought of little else since. I am asking you now, in front of everyone who has ever whispered about us, to know me fully, faults and grief and all, and to allow me the honor of knowing you in return, for whatever years God grants us. Clara Bennett, will you marry me?" The silence stretched, taut and glittering, the entire glittering hall holding its breath alongside her, and Clara felt tears rise, sudden and unstoppable, as she looked down at the man kneeling before her, the most feared duke in all of England, brought entirely to his knees not by any threat or scandal, but by one quiet word spoken months before in a dark and grieving study. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with the fullness of it. "Yes, Gideon. 1,000 times yes." The hall erupted, not with the cold, curious whispers that had followed Clara since her first evening in society, but with genuine, warm applause, and somewhere in the crowd, Clara caught sight of Lucy, who had been permitted to attend this particular occasion, jumping and clapping with unrestrained delight, her small face alight with a joy that held nothing at all of the sadness Clara had first found her curled around on a gray morning many months before. Gideon rose and drew Clara into his arms, and for the first time in 3 long years, the Duke of Netherby did not care in the slightest who was watching him, or what they might whisper about the sight of him laughing, openly and without reservation, in the center of a crowded ballroom. "All England will speak of this for months," he murmured against her hair, still holding her close as the musicians, at some unspoken signal, began to play once more. "Let them," Clara said, smiling against his shoulder. "I think it is high time all England learned that the fiercest hearts are so often the ones capable of the deepest love, once someone is brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to knock upon the door." They danced the rest of the evening in full view of a society that would, in the weeks and months to come, tell and retell the story of the fearsome duke who had knelt before a humble governess in the middle of Lord Ashcombe's ballroom, each retelling growing a little grander, a little more romantic, than the quiet, hard-won truth that had actually brought them to that moment. But Clara found she did not mind the exaggerations, the whispered legends that would follow them for years afterward. She knew the truth of it, the mud on the road, the broken glass horse on a dead man's writing desk, the long nights of careful patience that had slowly, gently coaxed a grieving man back into the light. That was a story worth far more than any grand legend society might choose to spin from it, and it belonged, in the end, entirely to the two of them. 3 years passed, and Netherby Hall bore little resemblance to the cold, silent house Clara had first arrived at on a rain-soaked evening, thrown from an overturned carriage into a life she could never have imagined for herself. The gardens, once left to slow neglect, bloomed again under the careful attention of a groundskeeper the Duke had finally seen fit to hire, and the halls that had once echoed with careful, frightened whispers now carried, more often than not, the sound of laughter, Lucy's especially, who had grown from a solemn, watchful child into a bright, curious girl of 10, utterly without fear of the uncle she adored. Clara often thought back, in quiet moments, to that first gray morning in the nursery, when she had sat beside a grieving child and promised nothing more than company through the heaviness of a difficult day. She had not known then how far that single small kindness would carry her, through storms and whispered scandal, and the slow, careful unlocking of a heart that had spent years convinced it was better left sealed away entirely. Gideon had changed too, in ways both large and small. He still carried Edward's memory with him, would always carry it, Clara suspected, in the quiet way grief settles permanently into the shape of a person rather than ever fully leaving them. But he visited his brother's old room now without the same haunted heaviness that had once driven him there alone in the small hours of the night. He had finally allowed the room to be gently changed, not erased, but softened. Sunlight let in through curtains that had stayed closed for years, and he brought Lucy there sometimes to tell her stories of the father she had been too young to properly remember. Stories that made the girl laugh as often as they made her uncle's eyes grow bright with tears he no longer felt the need to hide. The household staff, once so careful and frightened in his presence, had grown easy and warm around him in a way none of them could have imagined possible in those first difficult months of Clara's arrival. Mrs. Whitfield, who had offered Clara that first cautious cup of tea so many years before, now ran the household with a cheerful briskness that suited her far better than the anxious watchfulness she had once worn like armor of her own. Mr. Finch had been given greater authority over the estate's affairs, a trust the Duke extended readily now, having learned, in the hardest possible way, the value of allowing capable people close enough to help carry the weight he had once insisted on bearing entirely alone. Of Lord Carrow, little was heard in the years that followed his disgrace. Word occasionally reached Netherby of a diminished life abroad, ambitions curdled into bitterness, opportunities closed to him wherever his reputation eventually caught up with his charm. Clara found she felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that the shadow he had cast over the household had finally, fully lifted, leaving nothing behind but the ordinary, precious business of a family learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be happy again. Clara and Gideon's own children came in time, first a boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's steady, unflinching eyes, and later a girl who delighted, from her earliest days, in following Lucy about the house as though she were the sun around which the whole family orbited. Lucy, far from resenting the new additions, took to her role as elder sister with a warmth that suggested she had simply been waiting, all along, for a household full enough to hold all the love she had never stopped carrying inside her, even through the hardest years. On quiet evenings, when the children had finally been settled, and the house had eased into its familiar, comfortable silence, Clara and Gideon often sat together in the study that had once witnessed his most painful confessions, now made warm and welcoming by years of gentler conversation held within its walls. He would sometimes take her hand across the small distance between their chairs, and she would think in those moments of the man she had first seen riding out of the rain toward three armed strangers, his face utterly without expression, feared by every soul in England, and marvel quietly at how far that same man had traveled, one patient season at a time, toward the warmth she saw in him now. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her once, many years into their marriage, his voice carrying the particular softness it reserved only for her, and only in their most private moments together. Choosing a life with a man so many still whisper about, even now, however unfairly. "Never," Clara said, without a moment's hesitation, and meant it as fully as she had ever meant anything. "I did not fall in love with the Duke all England feared, Gideon. I fell in love with the man beneath him, the one who knelt beside a broken glass horse and let himself grieve in front of another person for the first time in 3 years. That man was never truly frightening at all. He was only waiting, patiently, for someone brave enough to see him clearly and kind enough to stay once they had." He drew her hand to his lips then, the gesture as tender and unhurried as anything she had ever known from him, and outside the tall windows of Netherby Hall, the gardens bloomed on into another quiet, golden evening, full of a peace that had taken 3 long years, one quiet word, and a courage neither of them had known they possessed, to finally fully earn.